Daniel had always believed that his time in space would be filled with discoveries of stars, minerals, and distant planets. He never thought his name would ever be connected with the fate of two worlds. He was just a soldier, one of many assigned, to protect the human delegation that had traveled light years away from Earth to negotiate with the alien empire. Their first meetings with the alien race had been tense, every word weighed carefully, every movement watched closely. Humans had heard rumors about the alien queen for years, how she ruled with wisdom, how her presence was both feared and respected, and how no one was ever allowed to come too close to her. She was seen as untouchable, almost sacred to her people. Daniel knew all of this, and yet he could not have predicted what would happen the day their paths crossed directly. It started in a way that was far less dramatic than the stories later made it sound. A meeting was being held inside one of the great halls of the alien palace, a building that seemed to be carved from both metal and stone, shining like crystal but heavy as mountains. The humans had been given a corner to stand in, while the alien royal guards watched them closely. Tension filled the air, as if one wrong step could start a war. Daniel kept his eyes low, trying to look calm, though his hand always rested near the weapon he carried. He had no plans to use it, but instinct told him never to let his guard down. The alien queen entered the hall with the kind of silence that made everyone aware of her before she even spoke. She moved gracefully, tall and elegant, wearing armor that looked like it was part of her very skin. Her presence filled the entire space. Daniel felt himself straighten without thinking, as if some invisible force demanded respect. She spoke in her language, her voice carrying authority, and her advisors answered her quickly. Daniel could not understand the words, but he could understand the mood, serious, urgent, commanding. Then something unexpected happened. A sudden tremor shook the palace, small but enough to make the floor beneath their feet shift. Some of the alien guards moved forward, their hands gripping their spears. One of the queen's attendants stumbled, and in the movement the queen herself lost balance for just a second. The entire hall froze. None of her people dared to move toward her. No one dared to reach out and help. She was their queen, their sacred leader. To touch her without permission was forbidden, but Daniel was not thinking about rules at that moment. He saw her stagger, saw that she might fall, and his human instinct took over before his mind had time to stop him. He stepped forward and reached out his arm. His hand landed gently against her forearm, steadying her weight before she could drop to the floor. It was a simple touch, natural to him, nothing more than what one person might do for another in a moment of need. But in that silent hall, the gesture was louder than thunder. The guards stiffened. Some lifted their weapons, their eyes blazing with shock. The alien attendants gasped, their faces frozen in disbelief. Daniel realized too late what he had done. His heart pounded against his chest, and for a moment he thought this was how he would die. Not in battle, not in some heroic sacrifice, but simply because he had tried to stop someone from falling. He quickly removed his hand and stepped back, waiting for the strike that would surely come, but the strike never came. Instead, the queen stood tall again, her balance restored, and turned her gaze toward him. Her eyes, strange yet mesmerizing, locked with his. The silence in the hall grew heavier. She did not speak at once, and Daniel had no idea what she was thinking. Was she angry? Was she insulted? He felt his palms begin to sweat as he stood, frozen, unable to move or breathe. Then, to his surprise, she raised her hand slightly, almost as though acknowledging what had just happened. She did not call for his punishment. She did not order her guards to cut him down. She simply studied him, her expression unreadable but strangely calm. The entire hall waited for her command, but none came. Daniel lowered his eyes, trying to show respect, though inside his head was spinning. Why hadn't she reacted with fury? Why had she not treated his touch as an insult? He could not make sense of it. He glanced up again just for a moment, and found that she was still looking at him, as if measuring him in ways he could not understand. The negotiations resumed shortly afterward, though the atmosphere had changed. The aliens whispered among themselves, their tones sharp and uneasy. The humans exchanged nervous looks, some glaring at Daniel, others silently thankful that disaster had not struck. But Daniel could barely focus on anything else. His mind replayed the moment again and again, his hand on her arm, her steadying against him, the lack of anger in her reaction. That night, he lay awake in the small quarters given to the human delegation. The walls seemed to hum with energy, alien technology alive all around him. He stared at the ceiling, thinking about what he had done. If she had chosen to see it as an insult, their mission would have ended instantly. Earth might have been at war by dawn, yet she had allowed it to pass. More than that, she had looked at him with something he could not name. Curiosity, perhaps? Respect? Or was it something far deeper? Something that frightened him because he did not understand it. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but the memory of her gaze stayed with him. It was not the cold stare of a ruler who demanded obedience. It was not the furious glare of someone who felt dishonored. It was something different, something personal, as if for one fleeting second she had seen him not as a soldier, not as a human, but simply as a person. Daniel did not know what this moment meant for the future. All he knew was that it had happened and there was no turning back. The smallest action and instinctive reach of his hand had crossed a boundary that no one had dared cross before. And somewhere in the silence of the night, he felt the truth, settle deep inside him. The story of that single touch had only just begun. In the days that followed the strange moment inside the Great Hall, Daniel tried his best to remain unnoticed. He performed his duties like every other soldier, standing guard during the human delegation's movements, keeping silent during meetings, and speaking only when necessary. But no matter how hard he tried to fade into the background, he could feel the alien queen's eyes on him. At first, he thought it was his imagination, a trick of nerves after what had happened. But soon, even the other humans began to notice. "She keeps looking at you," one of his fellow soldiers whispered when they marched together through the palace corridors. Daniel only shook his head, pretending not to care, though inside he felt a growing unease. Why was she watching him? Had she not already shown mercy by not punishing him? Why had she not dismissed him entirely from her presence? The palace was enormous, built from shining towers and wide courtyards that seemed to glow under the strange light of the alien sun. Every hallway was lined with guards, and every step echoed against the smooth, polished floors. Daniel's boots sounded too loud in such a place. He felt small, like an intruder in a world that was not his own. And yet, wherever he went, he sensed that she was aware of him, even when she was not in the same room. During negotiations, when both human leaders and alien advisors argued over trade routes, weapons, and treaties, Daniel would stand at the edge of the chamber, silent and alert. He did not understand most of the political words, but he understood the atmosphere: distrust, suspicion, caution. Yet every so often, when his eyes drifted upward, he caught the queen studying him. Not openly, but with the kind of subtle glances that carried weight. Once, their eyes met across the chamber, and though the moment lasted only a breath, Daniel felt it like a spark against his chest. Her people noticed too. The alien advisors exchanged murmurs, their expressions sour, as if they believed something improper was happening. Guards tightened their grips on their weapons whenever Daniel shifted even slightly. He knew he was walking on a line thinner than a thread. Yet strangely, the queen did not look away. If anything, her gaze lingered longer each time. Daniel thought back to the moment he had touched her. He remembered the warmth of her skin through the cold armor, the way she had steadied herself against him instead of pushing him away. He wondered if that memory haunted her as much as it haunted him. Perhaps it had broken some invisible barrier. Perhaps it had planted a seed of curiosity that could not be ignored. One evening, after a long day of tense discussions, Daniel wandered into one of the palace courtyards to clear his head. The air was cooler under the alien night, and the stars above were brighter than any he had ever seen on Earth. He sat on a stone bench, his helmet resting beside him, and let himself breathe. He thought he was alone, but then he heard the soft sound of footsteps, When he turned, he saw her, the queen herself, walking slowly into the courtyard with no guards at her side. Daniel jumped to his feet at once, his training kicking in. He bowed his head, unsure what else to do. She stopped a few paces away, her long robe catching the faint wind. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant hum of the palace walls. Then, to his surprise, she spoke in his language. Her words were accented, careful, as though she had practiced them many times before. "You are Daniel," she said softly. He blinked, shocked that she knew his name. "Yes, Your Majesty," he answered quickly, his voice low. She tilted her head, studying him in the starlight. "You touched me." The words sent a shiver down his spine. He wanted to explain, to apologize again, but before he could speak, she raised a hand to silence him. Her expression was unreadable, yet there was no anger in her voice. "No one has done this in many cycles. No one dares. But you did." Daniel swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. "I only wanted to help. You nearly fell." Her eyes lingered on him as though she was trying to decide if he was telling the truth. After a long pause, she gave the faintest nod, almost like a gesture of acceptance. Then she turned and began walking away, leaving Daniel rooted in place, his thoughts spinning faster than ever. That night, sleep escaped him once again. The following days grew stranger still. Whenever the queen entered a room, her people bowed, deeply, but Daniel noticed that her eyes often sought him first, even if only for a second. She never spoke to him directly in public, yet her silence carried more weight than words. Her advisors grew restless. Whispers spread like wildfire. Some believed the queen had chosen him for a reason. Others believed he had dishonored her and that she was merely waiting for the right moment to act. Daniel, caught in the center, could do nothing but wait. And yet, beneath his confusion and fear, there was also a growing sense of wonder. He had come to this world as nothing more than a soldier, an ordinary man tasked with ordinary duties. Now somehow he had become the focus of the most powerful being in the Empire. Why? What did she see in him? Why did she not look at the others the same way? Each day that passed made the mystery heavier. Daniel found himself noticing her more, as well. The calm way she moved, the steady strength in her voice, the loneliness that seemed to hide behind her regal mask. Perhaps it was his imagination, but he thought he could see it in her eyes. The burden of someone who carried too much responsibility, too much silence, too much distance from everyone around her. Maybe his touch had not just been a mistake. Maybe it had been something she had needed more than anyone realized. And so while the humans argued politics and the aliens debated customs, another story was quietly unfolding. A story hidden in glances, silence, and questions without answers. Daniel did not know where it was leading, but he knew this. Whatever bond had begun that day in the hall was not fading. It was growing stronger with every passing hour, and sooner or later, it would lead them both into uncharted territory. The ceremonial gathering was unlike anything Daniel had ever seen in his life. The grand chamber was filled with alien nobles, advisors, warriors, and attendants, all standing in rows beneath banners that stretched to the high ceiling. The walls glowed faintly with patterns that seemed to move like living art, and the air carried the low hum of alien instruments, a kind of music that felt both solemn and tense. The human delegation stood together at the far side, observing quietly, unsure of the customs and fearful of doing anything wrong. Daniel stood at attention, his hands resting behind his back, his face calm, though his mind was restless. He had already been the subject of too many whispers and stares since the day he had touched the queen. Some looked at him with suspicion, others with open disapproval, and still others with curiosity, as if they were waiting for him to make another mistake. He did his best to remain still, invisible, just another guard among many, but he was not invisible to her. The alien queen entered the chamber with the same grace and quiet power she always carried. She wore ceremonial armor that gleamed under the strange lights, its edges shaped like flowing waves. Her crown rested gently on her brow, its design unlike anything human hands could ever craft. When she walked, The hall seemed to shift with her, every eye following her every step. She took her place at the center and the room grew silent. Daniel's gaze lowered, though against his will he found himself stealing glances at her. He expected her to ignore him, to focus on the rituals of her people, but instead he saw her eyes drift toward him, steady and deliberate. For a moment it felt like the entire hall faded away, and only the two of them remained. His heart pounded and he quickly looked down again, telling himself he had imagined it. Then, something happened that he could never have predicted. The Queen rose from her seat, her long cloak flowing behind her as she moved. The crowd parted instantly, bowing low as she walked forward. Her steps echoed through the hall, and every alien lowered their head in reverence. Daniel, confused and uncertain, kept his eyes forward. He could not imagine why she was moving in his direction. His chest tightened as the realization struck. She was walking straight toward him. The humans beside him shifted uneasily, whispering under their breath. Daniel felt frozen in place, his training telling him not to move, not to react. The Queen stopped just a few feet away from him, her presence overwhelming. Then, in a voice that carried across the hall, she spoke, not in her own language, but in his. "Touch me again, human." The words cut through the silence like a blade. The entire hall gasped as one, the sound like a wave crashing against stone. Her people stared in disbelief, their faces pale with shock. The humans exchanged wide-eyed glances, some thinking they had misheard. But Daniel knew he had not misheard. The Queen had spoken directly to him, and her command was clear. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He felt as if time itself had stopped. To touch her once had been an accident, a mistake that had nearly cost him everything. To do it again, here in front of her people, felt like crossing a line so impossible it could never be undone. His instincts screamed at him to stay still, to avoid making a move that could ignite anger or conflict. And yet, when he looked into her eyes, he saw something that pushed all fear aside. Her gaze was steady, calm and waiting, not demanding, not angry, but filled with quiet certainty. His hand trembled as he slowly lifted it. He hesitated, his mind racing with doubts. What if this was a test? What if she was proving a point to her people? What if one wrong move meant his life was over? But then he remembered the moment in the hall when he had steadied her, the way she had looked at him afterward. That memory guided him now. With careful movement, he reached out and gently placed his hand against hers. The hall erupted. Gasps, shouts, murmurs all tangled together in a storm of disbelief. Guards tensed, their weapons shifting as if ready to strike, but the Queen lifted her other hand, silencing them without a word. She did not pull away from him. Instead, she allowed the touch to remain, her fingers curling slightly against his. The faintest smile crossed her lips, so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but to Daniel it felt like the sun breaking through the clouds. For a long moment, no one spoke. The chamber, filled with so many voices before, had fallen into a heavy silence once again. Daniel's heart hammered in his chest, his breath unsteady, but he did not move his hand away. He felt warmth in her touch, a kind of unspoken understanding that went deeper than words. In that single gesture, something powerful had been exchanged, something that could not be undone or ignored. Finally, the Queen withdrew her hand and turned back toward her throne. She walked with calm authority, her head held high as though nothing unusual had happened. Her people, however, could not hide their confusion. Whispers filled the hall again, sharp and restless, but none dared speak against her openly. The humans remained stiff with shock, unsure of whether what they had witnessed was a miracle or a disaster. Daniel stood frozen, his hand still tingling from the contact. He could hardly believe what had just taken place. He knew this moment would spread like fire across both worlds. It was no longer a secret act hidden in the chaos of a tremor. This had been public, deliberate, undeniable. The Queen had chosen to shatter tradition in front of everyone. When the gathering finally ended, the humans were escorted back to their chambers. The others questioned Daniel in hushed voices, asking why she had done it, what it meant if he had known it would happen. He could only shake his head. He had no answers. His thoughts were too heavy, his emotions too tangled. All he knew was that her words, her touch, and her faint smile would remain with him forever. As night fell over the alien palace, Daniel sat alone in his quarters, staring at his hands. The memory replayed again and again in his mind. The moment she had asked him, the weight of her gaze, the silence of the hall when their hands met. He felt both fear and wonder, uncertainty and hope. Something had changed that day, not just for him, but for her people, and perhaps even for all of humanity. And as he finally closed his eyes, one thought echoed within him. The Queen had not asked this of anyone else, she had asked it of him. The ceremony ended, but the waves it created did not fade away. The Queen's choice to let Daniel touch her in front of everyone spread across the palace like a storm. By the next morning, every hallway echoed with whispers, every courtyard hummed with rumors. The alien nobles looked uneasy, the guards seemed restless, and even the human delegation walked with tension in their steps. Daniel had become the center of attention, though he had never wished for it. The Queen, however, showed no sign of regret. She carried on with her duties as though nothing unusual had happened. When she sat on her throne, her voice was calm, steady, and commanding. But whenever Daniel was present, he could feel her eyes searching for him, pausing for a moment longer than necessary, as if to remind him that what had happened was not a mistake. Some of her people could not hide their anger. Daniel noticed the way certain advisors frowned when he walked by. Their whispers were sharper, their voices carrying frustration. A human, they said in their own tongue, unworthy of such honor. Though Daniel could not understand their exact words, he could read their faces well enough. He knew he was not welcome in their eyes. Yet strangely, the ordinary citizens of her empire began to react differently. When Daniel was escorted through the city that surrounded the palace, he noticed that people stared, not only with suspicion, but also with curiosity. Some even bowed slightly, as though he had been touched by her power. Word had spread far beyond the palace walls, and the story of the Queen's command had become something greater than a single moment. Daniel's fellow humans were divided as well. Some soldiers congratulated him in private, whispering that he had gained the trust of the most powerful figure in the galaxy. Others scolded him, telling him he had risked their entire mission for a gesture he barely understood. The delegation leaders debated endlessly, wondering if they should use this strange bond as a tool in negotiations. Daniel listened to them, but kept silent. Deep inside, he knew this was not something political. This was personal, and it belonged only to him and her. Their bond grew quietly in private meetings. The Queen began to summon him to her chambers, not as a soldier but as a companion in conversation. At first their talks were simple. She asked about Earth, about the oceans, the mountains, the forests, and the animals. Daniel described sunsets, storms, and the smell of rain on soil. She listened intently, her eyes softening as he spoke, as though she could see the places he described in her mind. In return, she told him about her world. She spoke of the weight of her crown, the endless expectations of her people, and the loneliness that came with power. Her words were never bitter, but there was a quiet sadness in them, a longing for someone who could see her not as a queen but as a person. Daniel understood more than he could put into words. He too had known the feeling of being surrounded by people yet standing alone. The simple act of touch, once forbidden, became something more. It was no longer just a symbol of rebellion against tradition. It became their way of speaking without words. Sometimes, when their conversations grew heavy, she would lift her hand toward him, and he would meet it with his own. The gesture carried comfort, trust, and a bond deeper than either of them had expected. But the world around them was not as gentle. Many in her court began to fear what this connection meant. Some believed she was weakening her rule by showing favoritism to an outsider. Others whispered of betrayal. Daniel noticed the growing unrest. Guards stared at him with harder eyes, and advisors raised their voices more often during meetings. He knew their patience was wearing thin. Still, the Queen did not waver. In public, she continued to stand tall, ignoring the whispers and stares. In private, she spoke to Daniel with honesty she had never given anyone else. She told him once in a quiet voice, "For years I have lived untouched, surrounded by walls built by my people's fear. But you broke through them without even trying." Daniel had no reply. He could only sit in silence, feeling the weight of her words press against his heart. And so, even as the storm outside grew louder, the bond inside the Queen's chambers grew stronger. The choice she had made, to ask him to touch her, to allow him into her world, was not one she would ever take back. The people might resist, the advisors might argue, but the Queen had already decided. She had seen something in Daniel that no tradition could erase. The change that began with a single touch soon spread beyond the palace, beyond the city, and across both worlds. What had once been seen as impossible was now spoken of in markets, in meeting halls, and even in the quiet corners of Earth. The Queen's decision to allow a human into her personal space became a story retold 1,000 different ways. Some called it scandal. Others called it destiny. But no one could deny its power. Daniel, though still a soldier at heart, became a symbol he had never wanted to be. When he walked through the palace, alien citizens looked at him with new eyes. Some bowed, some smiled faintly, others whispered prayers as though he carried a blessing. He had not fought any battles for them, yet in their minds he had broken the greatest wall of all, the wall of untouchability that had separated their Queen from the rest of the living world. For Daniel, the weight of this new role was heavy. He often wondered if he was ready for it, if he even deserved it. He had not set out to be special. He had only acted on instinct, reaching out to help someone in need. Yet that simple act had grown into something much larger, something that now carried the hope of 2 civilizations. The Queen, however, never let him drown in doubt. Whenever he struggled, she reminded him with her steady gaze that this was not about destiny or prophecy. It was about choice. "I chose you," she said once, her voice calm but certain. "Not because of what you represent, but because of who you are." Those words stayed with him. Slowly, the negotiations between humans and her people began to shift. The distrust that had once filled every room started to soften. Her advisors still argued, but their voices carried less force now. The humans, seeing the Queen's acceptance of Daniel, began to believe peace was truly possible. One touch had built a bridge that years of diplomacy had failed to create. Still, the path forward was not smooth. There were protests in the alien cities, groups that declared the Queen had betrayed tradition. Some demanded Daniel's removal. A few even whispered of rebellion. But the Queen did not bend. She faced her people with the same strength she always had, but now her strength was tempered with something new: connection. Her people could see that she was not weaker for allowing touch. She was stronger. She was human in a way they had never allowed her to be. And in that humanity, they found courage. Daniel stood at her side during many of these trials. He did not speak for her, nor did he try to take her place. He simply remained present, a quiet reminder of the choice she had made. The people noticed. They saw that he did not seek power or command. He sought only to stand beside her, and in time, this too began to soften hearts. Their bond became the foundation of a new alliance. Treaties were signed, trade routes opened, and promises of cooperation forged. But beyond all the politics, the real victory was something quieter: trust. For the first time, humans and her people looked at one another not only as rivals or strangers, but as potential friends. For Daniel, the greatest honor was not in the titles or recognition he received, but in the moments that belonged only to them, the quiet evenings when they spoke of dreams, when she listened to his stories of Earth, seas, and skies, when he listened to her memories of childhood beneath alien stars. These moments reminded him that beneath crowns, uniforms, and walls of duty, they were simply 2 beings who had found each other in a vast and lonely universe. In time, their story was told across galaxies. Poets spoke of the human who touched the untouchable queen. Children played games pretending to be them, reaching out hands across invisible lines. Scholars debated what it meant for culture, tradition, and history. But for Daniel and the queen, the truth was much simpler. It was not about legends or history books. It was about two lives that had crossed in a single moment and refused to part. Years later, Daniel often thought back to that first day in the Great Hall. The tremor, the instinctive reach of his hand, the shock that followed. He wondered what might have happened if he had hesitated. If he had not moved at all, perhaps war would have followed. Perhaps the distance between their worlds would have remained forever. But he had moved. He had touched her. And that choice had changed everything. For the queen, the memory of his hand in hers remained the most important part of her reign. She had faced battles, politics, and centuries of tradition, but the act that defined her rule was not one of conquest. It was one of connection. And so, their story lived on, not as a tale of power, but as a reminder that sometimes the smallest gestures, one hand reaching for another, can carry the weight of entire worlds.